The dark side. Yep, it's all about the dark side. Mark Twain once had a quote, and he said, "We're all like the moon. Everybody has a dark side." And I think that his analysis on human nature was right on target. Because deep down inside of every human being, there is an inclination to evil. The Bible talks about the fallen nature. It talks about the flesh. We know that we are drawn to sin. If we don't put guardrails up, we step across boundaries that we shouldn't step across. And we've all sinned. That's what the Scripture tells us. In Ephesians chapter 4 and chapter number 5, Paul has been drawing a stark contrast between what life looked like for the Ephesians before Christ and what it should look like after Christ. In fact, in the 8th verse here, Paul says, "For you were formerly darkness." Think about that. You were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. So Paul is drawing this contrast. And we have to understand that when we come to Christ, when we are born again, when we experience salvation through Jesus, we should have a different set of morals and a different set of values. We must avoid at all cost the dark side, the life before Christ. And Paul talks here about dark side behavior. In verse number 3, he said, "But immorality or impurity or greed must not even be named among you as proper among the saints." So Paul said, now that you are Christians, people should not mention immorality, impurity, or greed in the same conversation with you. And here's an important point that I want to make from the get-go tonight, that when it comes to love, when it comes to sex, we have to understand that God has given these as gifts to us, and they are to be kept in the confines of marriage between a husband and a wife. And yet the enemy of our soul, Satan, is the one who counterfeits. He counterfeits every good thing that God does for us. Every blessing, every good thing that the Lord wants to give to us, He has a counterfeit for it. And sadly, for many people today, love has been reduced to some kind of a sensual, shallow, emotional, physical feeling. And this, my friend, is what leads to immorality and impurity that Paul is talking about. So I want to look at these words and break them down quickly. The word immorality is the word porneia, which refers to any kind of sexual sin, fornication, adultery, etc., etc. Paul mentions here impurity. Impurity means unclean, filthy, or perverted. And then Paul talks about greed, and this is so important for us to understand. Greed is all about being selfish. We know that when we're greedy, we're selfish. When we're greedy, we are self-centered. When we're greedy, it's all about us. And it's greed that drives immorality. It's the greed of money that drives pornography. It's the greed of money that drives trafficking. It's the greed of money that drives prostitution. All of these things are motivated, and Paul lumps them together: immorality, impurity, and greed. And these kind of practices and behaviors were very prevalent in Ephesus. Ephesus was a large city, and it was known for idolatry. It was known for sexual immorality. And I really feel like we as a country are headed that way. If you think about how prevalent sexual advertising is today. Pepsi uses sexual advertising, Victoria's Secret, Levi's, Abercrombie and Fitch, and the list goes on. Advertisers know, researchers know that sexually appealing content and imagery are used to shape you and I's mind as consumers. Our perception of a product is affected by how they advertise. And man, they do it. We see it on television. We see it on the internet. And as Christians, we have to be extremely careful to guard our hearts, because we know that just because we're born again, just because we are children of the light, doesn't mean that we can't be tempted. We're not exempt from temptation. And that's exactly why Paul was writing to these believers who were born again and filled with the Spirit, reminding them, you were darkness. This is the stuff you were involved in. But now you are children of light, so walk in the light. So for you and I, we need to do our very best to avoid the dark side, because the dark side, my friend, is dangerous and it is demonic. So Paul talks about the dark side of behavior, then he talks about the dark side of conversation. And in the 4th verse, here's what he tells us. And there must be no filthiness and silly talk or coarse jesting, which is not fitting, but rather giving thanks. So again, I want to break these down as we did in verse number 3. Filthiness, what is that? Any kind of shameless, any kind of obscene kind of talk. That is not what should be coming out of our mouth as believers. Silly talk. The word there is moros. And in the Greek, it really means moron. That's where we get our word moron. And what he's talking about here, silly talk, is anything that's intellectually deficient, anything that's reckless, anything that's needless, anything that's unproductive. Man, don't waste your breath on that kind of stuff. And then Paul mentions coarse jesting. Coarse jesting is any kind of inappropriate or obscene sexual humor. Paul said, hey, you were darkness, you are not, or you are light. So you have to be careful about going back to the dark side behavior. You have to be careful to going back to dark side conversation. And this is where the enemy wants to take us. Remember, he has a counterfeit for everything. This is what the dark side looks like. This is what our lives look like before Christ, but should not be where we are today. Paul said, rather, we ought to give thanks. What comes out of our mouth ought to be thankfulness, ought to be gratitude. And Paul mentioned in chapter 4, verse 29, that our words should minister grace and encouragement to people. So, talks about the dark side of behavior, talks about the dark side of conversation, and then he talks about the consequences of dark side. The dark side consequences, verse number 5. For this you know with certainty that no immoral or impure person or covetous man, that's greedy, who is an idolater has an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience, those that practice the dark side. Therefore, Paul said, do not be partakers with them. Again, this is the way you used to live. This is how you should live. You used to be in darkness, now you're in light. Walk in light. And I don't know about you, but when I read verse 5, 6, and 7, Paul uses some really strong language. He says that they're not going to inherit the kingdom of heaven. Now, I don't think I'm any different than you. When I read that kind of stuff, it makes me feel uncomfortable. It makes me feel uneasy. But it should make us feel uneasy, because it should help us and remind us of how dangerous and demonic the dark side is. How important it is for you and I to guard our heart, to guard our eye gate and our ear gate, and not feed those kind of things where we're led away in temptation and we step back across the line. Think about this. Why would anybody gamble with their eternal destiny? I've never understood why people think it's, eternity is some kind of a game. It's not a game. Why would anybody go over Niagara Falls in a rubber inner tube? Why would you stand on a railroad track and play chicken with a speeding train? Why would you play Russian roulette with a loaded pistol? Well, you're not going to do that. That's ridiculous. That's dangerous. Well, it's dangerous, Paul is saying. It's dangerous for us to live on the dark side. So I don't know where you are in your relationship with the Lord, but I think after reading this tonight, we need to tighten things up. We need to make sure we draw the line and we don't step across the line. I appreciate you. I always appreciate you being with me for a midweek moment, and I hope that I see you in one of our services right here at New Life, 9:15 or 11:15 every Sunday morning. Take care.